Eleanor Nell Hayes drives into the Pine Barrens, the foreboding forest where her brother vanished a year ago. The narrow road winds through towering pines, their twisted branches clawing at the sky as if warning her away. In the nearby town, whispers of the Jersey Devil mix with fearful stories of disappearances no one can explain. Armed with her brother's notes and her own determination, Nell ventures closer to the trees, where shadows seem to breathe and voices ride the wind. She came seeking answers, but the forest has its own secrets, ancient and hungry, waiting to be revealed. The road into the Pine Barrens was a narrow ribbon of asphalt flanked by towering pines, their skeletal branches clawing at the pale dawn sky as if warning travelers away. Eleanor Nell Hayes gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening, eyes scanning the dense forest that seemed to press in from both sides. The air was thick with mist, softening the edges of the trees and muting the sounds of the waking woods. Somewhere deep within that shadowed green, her brother Tommy had vanished a year ago, swallowed whole by silence and secrets. Her car's tires hummed against the road, the engine a small defiance against the oppressive quiet. As she neared the outskirts of the small town nestled at the forest's edge, the landscape shifted. Neat front yards gave way to weathered clapboard buildings, and the scent of pine was tinged now with something older, darker. Nell parked outside a modest diner, the kind where the locals gathered in the early hours, nursing coffee and their own guarded fears. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of strong brew and fried breakfast. The chatter was low, voices dropping whenever she glanced their way. Nell sat at the counter, pulling a worn notebook from her bag. She had learned to listen first, to let the stories come to her. Early whispers spoke of the Jersey Devil, a creature of myth. Wings beating the night air, a scream that chilled the blood. But the disappearances were no myth, and the unease was tangible. "You're not from around here," a gruff voice said behind her. Deputy Marcus Flynn's face was weathered, eyes sharp beneath a furrowed brow. There was skepticism in his tone, but also a hint of something else. Protectiveness, maybe, or warning. "No," Nell replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm here about my brother." Marcus's jaw tightened. Lots come looking for answers. Pines don't give them up easy. Their conversation was brief, marked by careful words and unspoken tension. The deputy's knowledge of the forest was clear, but so was his reluctance to believe in the legends Nell was chasing. Still, he offered a map and a nod toward the darker trails, unmarked paths, where the disappearances had occurred. That afternoon, Nell wandered to the forest's edge. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks blackened with age and moss, needles whispering secrets in the restless wind. She could almost hear the forest breathing, alive with hidden eyes and shadowed movements. The sun dipped low, casting long, twisting shadows that danced unsettlingly on the forest floor. She jotted notes in her journal, fingers trembling slightly. The pines were no ordinary woods. They held stories older than the townsfolk dared speak aloud. And somewhere beneath those stories, something waited, hungry, patient, and ancient. Night fell with a sudden chill, wrapping the town in darkness that felt too thick, too close. Nell's room in the small inn was sparse, but the windows framed the looming silhouette of the pines. As she lay awake, the wind carried whispers, or were they voices? Through the trees, curling tendrils of fear that seeped into her bones. Sleep was elusive. Dreams mingled with memories of Tommy's last days. His smile haunted by obsession, his notes filled with frantic sketches of creatures and symbols. Nell knew the path ahead would test her resolve, The line between myth and reality was thinner here, and the forest's shadows held more than just the night. But she was ready to confront whatever waited, for Tommy, for the truth. And as the pines whispered on, a darker presence stirred. The road had led her here, but the real journey was only beginning. Nell sat up, the journal open on her lap, pen poised for the stories the forest would tell. Outside, the darkness deepened. The whispers never ended. Eleanor Nell Hayes pushed open the heavy wooden door of the sheriff's office, the low creak echoing in the small, dimly lit room. The air smelled faintly of dust and leather, an odor that clung to the worn furniture and faded wallpaper. Behind the desk, a woman in uniform looked up from a cluttered stack of paperwork. Her eyes were sharp, no nonsense, and carried the weight of responsibility that came with keeping a small town safe. "Sheriff Linda Carraway," the woman said, her voice steady but cautious. "You're the journalist from Philly, right? Hear about your brother?" Nell nodded, clutching the strap of her backpack tighter. "Yes, I'm Eleanor Hayes. I need to ask some questions about the disappearances." Before the sheriff could respond, a door at the side opened, and a man stepped into the room, stocky and weathered, with a face shaped by years spent outdoors. His leather jacket was worn, and his eyes held a wary skepticism as they flicked from Nell to the sheriff. "Deputy Marcus Flynn," he introduced himself gruffly. "I'll be your point of contact." Nell extended her hand, and he shook it firmly but without warmth. "I've heard about your brother. Sorry, thank you," Nell said quietly. "I know he vanished in these woods, but I have to find out what happened." Marcus's jaw tightened. "A lot of folks around here don't like to talk about it, especially with outsiders." Sheriff Carraway nodded. "It's been a rough year, people scared, disappearances piling up." Nell leaned forward. "What can you tell me?" Marcus glanced out the window toward the dense pine forest that bordered the town. "People go in and don't come out. Hikers, hunters, even locals. We find nothing, no signs, no bodies, just gone. It's not natural." "Have you heard anything about the Jersey Devil?" Nell asked, watching his reaction closely. The deputy's eyes darkened. "Stories, legends. Some say it's just superstition to scare kids, but others, they swear it's real." Nell's pulse quickened. "Do you believe it?" He shrugged, a flicker of conflict crossing his face. "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know fear when I see it, and this town's full of it." After their meeting, Nell stepped outside into the chill afternoon, the forest looming like a silent giant. She made her way to the local diner, a humble building where townsfolk gathered. The low murmur of conversation fell to hushed whispers when she entered. She caught fragments: Jersey, devil, curse, don't go near the pines. Eyes darted nervously to the windows where shadows stretched long beneath the setting sun. At a corner table, an older man spoke in a low voice to a small group. "I saw it once, years ago. Red eyes, glowing, wings like a bat, claws sharp as knives. It's watching, waiting." Nell scribbled notes, her skepticism wrestling with a growing sense of unease. The stories were more than mere folklore, they were warnings. The following day, Marcus offered to drive her along a rough, forested road. The car rattled over gravel as the towering pines closed in, their needles whispering in the breeze. Marcus recounted recent cases: missing hikers, strange noises, unexplained shadows seen at dusk. His tone mixed frustration with a reluctant belief in the unexplainable. "I want to believe there's a logical explanation," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "But every time we think we're close, something slips through." Nell looked out at the thick woods, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. The forest seemed alive, watching. That night, alone in her rented cabin on the edge of town, Nell sat by the window, her journal open but untouched. Outside, the wind stirred the pine needles, carrying faint whispers that seemed almost human. She strained to listen, heart pounding. Were they warnings, calls for help, or something darker? Her thoughts tumbled over the stories she'd heard. The fear in the eyes of townsfolk and the unresolved mystery of her brother's disappearance. The shadows outside flickered like tentacles, reaching into her mind. Nell's voice broke the silence as she whispered, "What are you hiding?" The forest seemed to answer with a sigh, and the night deepened around her. With each passing hour, the veil between myth and reality thinned, pulling Nell deeper into a mystery where every whisper could mean death or revelation. She knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, but the truth was a beacon she could not resist. The Jersey Devil was no longer just a legend. It was a key to something far older and far more terrifying, and Nell was determined to uncover it. The forest greeted Eleanor Hayes with a silence so thick it felt almost physical, pressing against her eardrums like a weight. She stood at the edge of the pine barrens, the dense pines towering above her like sentinels guarding their secrets. Twilight bled through the canopy in thin, fading streaks, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to sway with a life of their own. Nell's breath formed small clouds in the cool air as she adjusted the strap on her backpack, her eyes scanning the dimming landscape. For hours, she had been listening to the whispered warnings of the townsfolk. But now, alone among the ancient trees, those stories took on a new gravity. The disappearances weren't just local gossip or the product of overactive imaginations. They were real, tangible, and something about the forest itself felt wrong. The Jersey Devil, a name repeated in hushed tones, was only the beginning of the mystery. Nell had to know what lurked beyond the veil of superstition. Her boots crunched softly on the carpet of pine needles as she stepped deeper beneath the branches, senses alert to every rustle and shift. The wind was a ghostly breath, stirring the needles with a mournful sigh. Shadows flitted at the edges of her vision, vanishing whenever she turned to confront them. A cold prickle crawled down her spine as she realized the forest was watching her back. Nell stopped abruptly, heart hammering, as a sudden snap of a twig echoed nearby. She froze, eyes wide, trying to pierce the darkness. A shadow slipped between two trees, too quick, too fluid to be any animal she knew. It was dark and formless, but the way it moved suggested intelligence or malice. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her notebook, pulling it free to jot down the moment before the sensation passed like a fading nightmare. Back at her tentative campfire, the flickering flames cast jittering light over her journal as she scribbled notes about the strange occurrences and the growing sense of menace. The forest's sounds surrounded her, the quiet rustle of leaves, the distant call of a nightbird, the soft patter of unseen footsteps. Every noise seemed amplified by the oppressive stillness, each whisper on the wind a reminder that she was not alone. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward, and Nell's gaze drifted to the blackness beyond the firelight. What secrets did this forest keep? What ancient forces stirred beneath its roots? She paused, fingers hovering over the page, then wrote with renewed determination. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could be a clue. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, a beam of light slicing the night like a blade. Deputy Marcus Flynn approached cautiously, his worn leather jacket blending into the gloom. His face, weathered and set in a skeptical frown, softened slightly as he called out. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Miss Hayes," he said, voice low but firm. "This place, it's different. not just stories. Something's wrong. Nell looked up, meeting his gaze. I'm not here to panic, Marcus. I want to understand. He nodded slowly, the tension between them easing just enough to form an uneasy alliance. Well, then you'll need all the eyes and ears you can get. But be careful, the pines don't give up their secrets easily. As Marcus stood beside her, the forest seemed to lean in closer, the shadows deepening and shifting as if aware of their intrusion. Nell felt the pulse of the pines beneath her feet, a heartbeat older than any myth. This was no longer just a search for a missing brother. It was a descent into a living nightmare, where the line between folklore and reality blurred into darkness. And the shadows in the trees were watching, waiting. With a steadying breath, Nell closed her journal and looked into the woods beyond, the whisper of the pines promising that the true horror was only just beginning. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy of the pine barrens, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with a restless life of their own. Eleanor Nell Hayes pulled her jacket tighter around her, the chill creeping in despite the season. Her boots crunched softly over the carpet of pine needles and dried leaves as she made her way along the narrow, winding path that led to the edge of town. Ahead, nestled among gnarled oaks and towering pines, stood a small, weather-beaten cabin, Mabel Crane's home. Nell hesitated a moment, her breath visible in the cool air, before stepping forward. The cabin's wooden walls were faded and cracked, adorned with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the eaves and the faint scent of sage permeating the air. The windows, clouded with age, caught the last golden rays of sunlight, casting a muted glow inside. Her fingers brushed the worn handle, and she rapped gently. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with a slender frame, silver hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight. Mabel Crane's piercing eyes studied Nell with a mixture of curiosity and something far older, a deep knowing that seemed to reach beyond time itself. You must be Eleanor, Mabel said, her voice low but steady. The girl who's come to stir the old ashes. Nell swallowed, the weight of the nickname settling uneasily on her shoulders. I'm looking for answers, she replied. About my brother, about the disappearances, and about the Jersey Devil. Mabel's gaze softened, but a shadow passed over her face. Answers come at a price, child, and sometimes they lead to places darker than any shadow you've known. Invited inside, Nell stepped into a room thick with the scent of dried herbs, earth, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with jars of roots, powders, and strange charms. The flicker of candlelight danced across faded symbols carved into wooden talismans and brittle pages of yellowed parchment pinned to the walls. Mabel gestured toward a worn armchair by the hearth. Sit, we have much to discuss. As Nell settled into the chair, the fire's warmth battling the chill in the room, Mabel began her tale. It wasn't the Jersey Devil story Nell expected. No sharp claws or screeching wings. Instead, Mabel spoke of the forest itself, an ancient living entity with a heart blackened by forgotten sorrow and rage. The devil you've heard of, Mabel murmured, is but a mask, a story spun to keep the true darkness at bay. Beneath these pines lies something older, a primordial, shade-bound long ago by rites lost to time. It feeds not just on flesh, but on fear itself, growing stronger as the tales are whispered and the shadows lengthen. Nell's eyes narrowed, bound. How Mabel reached into a wooden box beside her, retrieving a faded amulet carved from dark wood. Upon it, an ancient symbol twisted in a knot of lines and circles. Her hands trembled slightly as she cradled it. A pact was made generations ago between those who lived here and the shade beneath. They traded silence and secrecy for protection. But the forest remembers, and the balance is fragile. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a shiver down Nell's spine. The room seemed to darken, shadows pooling in corners where none had been moments before. "You feel it too," Mabel said softly, eyes gleaming. "The forest watches, listens, it waits, and it's hungry." Nell nodded slowly, a mixture of dread and determination settling in her chest. "Then I have to find out what happened to Tommy, to all of them." Mabel's gaze held hers, grave and unyielding. "Be careful, Eleanor. Sometimes knowing the truth is the beginning of losing yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into twilight, Nell stepped back onto the path. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but beneath it lurked something darker, an ancient breath that whispered promises and threats alike. The shadows seemed to reach out, curling at the edges of her vision. Nell swallowed hard, clutching her notebook close. The forest was alive, and its secrets were beginning to stir. She walked on, the weight of Mabel's words heavy in her mind. The Jersey Devil was only the surface. Beneath the pines, something far older and far worse was awakening. And Nell was determined to face it, no matter the cost. The fading light outside her cabin cast long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards as Eleanor Nell Hayes settled into the creaking armchair by the window. Her fingers trembled slightly, the chill in the air seeping into her bones as she unfolded a fragile, yellowed piece of paper. The paper was worn at the edges, creased deeply as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times. It was a fragment of her brother Tommy's journal, something she had found tucked away in an old box beneath the floorboards of the family home before she left for the Pine Barrens. She traced the hurried, jagged handwriting with a mixture of reverence and dread. The words were scrawled in a frenzy of fear and obsession, a testament to the unraveling of Tommy's mind in the days before he vanished. "The Jersey Devil isn't just a myth," one passage read. The ink smudged as if her brother's hand had shaken too violently to keep steady. "There's something older, something watching. I hear it in the night, in the trees. It knows." Nell's breath caught. The words echoed the whispers she had heard in town. But there was something raw and personal here, a secret only Tommy had dared to write. The scent of pine wafted through the open window, mingling with the musty aroma of old paper and ink. Outside, the forest loomed like a living entity, dark and impenetrable beneath the gathering dusk. She leaned back, the chair creaking beneath her weight, and closed her eyes for a moment. Memories surged forward unbidden. Tommy's eager face illuminated by the flickering light of a campfire, his voice animated as he shared stories of strange noises and fleeting shadows glimpsed among the pines. "You have to believe me, Nell," he had said, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "There's something out there beyond the Jersey Devil, something older." Her heart ached with the weight of loss and unanswered questions. What had driven him so deep into the forest's secrets? What had he seen that terrified him enough to disappear without a trace? As the twilight deepened, the wind stirred the trees outside, sending a cascade of rustling leaves that sounded almost like whispered warnings. Nell's gaze snapped to the window, the shadows seeming to press against the glass like dark fingers reaching in. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Turning back to the journal, she found passages describing eerie sounds that defied explanation. Low growls, indistinct murmurs, and the unsettling sensation of being watched from the shadows. Tommy had written of strange symbols carved into bark, of fleeting glimpses of a dark, shifting figure with glowing eyes. The more she read, the more the legend of the Jersey Devil felt like a mask for something far more terrifying. Determined not to let her brother's fate remain a mystery, Nell began copying the entries into her own notebook, piecing together the fragments of his final days. The forest outside seemed to lean in closer, its ancient breath heavy with secrets and menace. The boundary between myth and reality blurred as the journal's revelations settled in, driving Nell deeper into the heart of the Pine Barrens' shadowed enigma. The night stretched on, and with every turn of the page, the forest's whisper grew louder in her mind, a haunting refrain that promised both danger and the truth she so desperately sought. But the closer she drew to that truth, the more she felt the cold grip of something watching, waiting beneath the ancient pines, and she knew, without doubt, that nothing in the Pine Barrens would ever be the same again. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor, Nell Hayes, and Deputy Marcus Flynn made their way deeper into the Pine Barrens, their boots sinking softly into the damp undergrowth. The oppressive blanket of night had descended early, swallowing the faint glow of the setting sun and leaving the woods cloaked in darkness. Nell's breath came out in shallow puffs, visible in the cold air, as she adjusted the strap of her backpack and tightened her grip on the flashlight. Beside her, Marcus moved with practiced ease, his worn leather jacket rustling faintly as he navigated the uneven ground. They had reached the site of the latest disappearance, small clearing just beyond a thicket of twisted pines. The local sheriff had reluctantly agreed to let Nell accompany Marcus on the investigation, his skepticism tempered by the mounting evidence that something was amiss. As they stepped into the clearing, Nell's eyes immediately caught the jagged carvings etched into the bark of several trees. The symbols were unlike anything she had seen before, angular lines intersecting in chaotic patterns, some resembling runes, others more abstract, their meaning obscured by time. "Look at this," Nell whispered, crouching to examine the closest tree. Her fingers traced the rough grooves, and a shiver ran down her spine. "These aren't random, they're deliberate." Marcus squinted, his face weathered and serious. "Never seen markings like this out here. Could be some kind of old ritual, maybe tied to the settlers or native tribes." The air around them grew heavier, the usual chorus of night creatures conspicuously absent. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, just a suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. Nell's heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the tree line, the beam of her flashlight trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head, eyes narrowed. "Nothing, too quiet." "That's the worst kind of quiet." Suddenly, a rustle near the edge of the clearing caught Nell's attention. She swung her light toward the sound, but all she saw were shifting shadows, elongated and flickering as if the forest itself was breathing. She blinked hard, questioning her senses. Was something watching them? "Did you see that?" Nell murmured. "See what?" Marcus replied, tension creeping into his voice. Something moved, just there. They advanced cautiously, each step measured and deliberate. Marcus knelt beside a patch of disturbed earth, brushing away leaves to reveal faint markings etched into the soil lines, forming a circle broken by jagged spikes. The unmistakable sign of a ritual site. "This is no ordinary disappearance," Marcus said grimly. "Whatever's out here, it's been here a long time." Nell swallowed hard, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a dark cloud. The ancient symbols and unnatural silence were pieces of a puzzle far larger and far darker than she had anticipated. As the forest whispered around them, promising secrets and shadows, Nell knew their investigation had crossed a threshold. "We need to find out what these symbols mean," she said, determination hardening her voice, "before more people vanish." Marcus nodded, his usual skepticism replaced by a grim resolve. "Then we better get to work." As they retreated from the clearing, the shadows seemed to close in behind them, the forest alive with unseen eyes. The signs of the old darkness were no longer hidden, they were a warning. And Nell felt, deep in her bones, that the Pine Barrens were watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. The night stretched on, thick with foreboding, as the two allies prepared to confront the ancient evil stirring beneath the trees. The boundary between myth and reality was dissolving, and the forest's sinister heart beat faster with every step they took. The whispers in the pines had grown louder and there was no turning back now. The town hall was packed beyond capacity, the wooden benches groaning under the weight of anxious bodies. Eleanor Nell Hayes slipped in through the side door, clutching her worn leather journal close to her chest. The air inside was thick with tension, a mixture of sweat, old wood, and the faint scent of pine carried in from outside. The murmurs grew louder as the clock struck 7, and the mayor called the meeting to order. Voices erupted almost immediately. "They're just accidents," a burly man shouted from the front row. "People get lost in the woods all the time. No need to scare ourselves with ghost stories." A sharp retort came from an elderly woman near the back. "Ghost stories don't make me laugh. These woods have been cursed since the settlers came. The Jersey Devil, the old pact sits, all real. You just refuse to see it." Nell felt the weight of every accusing glance, every whispered suspicion. She scanned the crowd, recognizing faces from around town, the store owner, the schoolteacher, hunters, and farmers, all wrapped in their own fears and doubts. Deputy Marcus Flynn stood near the sheriff's podium, his arms crossed, jaw tight as he tried to maintain order. Sheriff Linda Caraway raised her hands for silence. "Everyone, please, let's keep this civil. We're here to talk facts, not legends." But facts were hard to come by. The disappearances had no clear explanation. Search parties returned empty-handed, and no one had seen a trace of the missing. The fear of the unknown gnawed at the edges of reason. Jonas Red, the local hunter, stood suddenly. His voice was low but carried through the hall. "I've seen it. The Jersey Devil, or whatever you want to call it. I was out tracking deer near the old cranberry bogs when I heard this screech like nothing natural. Then I saw it, a shadow with wings and glowing red eyes. It wasn't just a story. It's real, and it's hunting us." Murmurs swept through the crowd like wildfire. Some scoffed, others shuddered. Nell's heart pounded. Every story, every whisper shed gathered so far, pointed to something larger, darker. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "We need to stay grounded. Fear makes people see monsters where there are none. We're doing everything we can, searches, patrols, safety measures. But spreading panic won't help anyone." The room split further. One side nodded in agreement. The other jeered. The meeting threatened to spiral out of control. From her perch near the back, Nell opened her journal, scribbling quick notes. She felt the isolation deepen. The very people she hoped to help were turning on each other, divided by fear and disbelief. She knew that to find answers, she'd have to navigate these fractured loyalties carefully. When the meeting finally adjourned, the crowd spilled into the chilly night air. Nell lingered near the doorway, watching the groups form and dissolve like shifting shadows. Mabel Crane approached quietly, her silver hair catching the moonlight. "They're scared," she said softly, eyes piercing. But fear is the forest's oldest weapon. It feeds on division, on mistrust. Nell nodded, feeling the weight of Mabel's words settle over her like a shroud. How do we stop it? Mabel's gaze drifted to the dark tree line. By remembering the old ways and accepting that some darkness can never be fully understood. The forest closed in around them, whispering secrets Nell was only beginning to hear. The town was fracturing, and with it, the fragile hope of uncovering the truth. But she would not turn away, not now. As Nell walked back to her rented cabin, the shadows seemed to reach for her, the whispers growing louder. The divisions in the town were just the beginning. Something ancient was stirring, and the forest's dark heart beat steadily beneath the surface. Her resolve hardened. Whatever it took, she would face the darkness alone if she had to. The night was far from over, and the whispers never truly ceased. The cabin was a sanctuary of shadows and scents, a world apart from the restless forest surrounding it. Nell stepped inside with tentative curiosity, her boots thudding softly on the creaking wooden floorboards. Herbs hung from the rafters in bundles, their faded leaves whispering secrets in the flickering candlelight. The air was thick with the musky perfume of sage, juniper, and something earthier, something slightly sweet and ancient. Mabel Crane sat by the hearth, her silver hair catching the firelight like strands of moonbeam, her piercing eyes fixed on Nell with a weight that seemed to carry centuries. "You're looking for answers," Mabel said, her voice a brittle thread woven with both warmth and warning. "But some truths don't come easily, and some stories are sung by shadows older than the pines themselves." Nell nodded, settling into the worn armchair opposite Mabel. The room's dimness seemed to close in, pressing against her skin like the forest's own breath. She pulled her journal from her bag and opened it, the pages crisp and filled with hastily scrawled notes and sketches. The disappearances, the Jersey Devilets, more than just legend, isn't it? Mabel's gaze hardened, the flicker of flames casting shifting patterns on her lined face. The Jersey Devil is a mask, a tale to frighten children and keep wanderers wary. But beneath the bark and the soil, something older stirs. She reached beneath the table and produced a small, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn by time. Long ago, before the settlers and the roads, before even the legends took root, the people who lived here made a pact, not with gods or spirits, but with the forest itself, or the force that dwells within it. Nell leaned forward, her pulse quickening. A pact? What kind of pact? Mabel opened the tome carefully, revealing pages etched with cryptic symbols, drawings of twisted trees and shadowy figures with burning eyes. "This was to bind the primordial shade," she said. "An ancient evil older than any story told around a campfire. They sealed it beneath the pines, using rites lost to time." The weight of those words settled in Nell's chest like a stone. She traced the symbols with a finger, feeling their cold, mysterious energy seep through the paper. "And it's waking up again." Mabel's eyes darkened. The forest feels the stirrings. The shadows lengthen. The animals grow restless. The pact weakens as people forget, and the land is disturbed. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo the warning in Mabel's voice. Nell's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the mystery with this new, chilling context. The disappearances were not random. The Jersey Devil, not the true threat it, was the forest's ancient heart, and its hunger was awakening. "What can we do?" Nell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mabel closed the book and placed it gently on the table. She reached up to her neck and pulled out a worn amulet, its surface scratched and dull but undeniably potent. "This," she said, is a fragment of the Pact's power. It's a link to the old rites, a reminder that the darkness can be held at bay. But it takes more than talismans and stories. It takes belief, courage, and sacrifice. Nell held the amulet in her hand, feeling its cold weight sink into her skin. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, its shadows pressing against the window pane like fingers hungry to reach inside. The line between myth and reality blurred, and Nell understood that her journey was no longer one of mere investigation. She was now a part of a story much larger, older, and far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. As the night deepened, the whispers in the pine barrens grew louder, carrying echoes of a pact forged in fear, bound by hope, and threatened by a darkness that refused to be forgotten. And somewhere beneath the ancient trees, the primordial shade waited. The sun hung low over the pine barrens, its amber rays filtering through the dense canopy in dying slants of light that seemed reluctant to leave the world beneath. Eleanor Nell Hayes tightened the straps on her backpack and consulted the faded map once more, her breath misting in the cool, early evening air. She had been told to find Jonas Reed's cabin by the old logging road that twisted like a serpent through the woods. The journey to this meeting was more than just a bullet point on her list. It was a step into the heart of the forest's secrets. Jonas Reed was a name that came up often in hushed conversations around the town's diner and the sheriff's office. A hunter and woodsman who had lived most of his life in the shadow of the pines. He was known for his gruff demeanor and uncanny knowledge of the land. But more than that, he was one of the few locals willing to speak openly about the Jersey Devil sightings, though his accounts went far beyond the usual folklore. Nell's boots crunched on the carpet of pine needles and brittle leaves as she followed the narrow trail. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and the occasional call of a distant owl. Yet beneath the natural chorus, there was an undercurrent, subtle, almost imperceptible tension that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. After nearly an hour, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing with a weathered cabin nestled among towering pines. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, and the faint scent of burning wood mingled with the earthy forest aroma. Nell approached cautiously, her journal clutched tightly in her hand. The door creaked open before she could knock. Jonas Reed stood framed against the dim light inside, his rugged face shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. His eyes, sharp and wary, studied her for a long moment. "You're the journalist, right? Eleanor Hayes." His voice was gravelly, shaped by years of outdoor life and quiet solitude. "That's me," Nell replied, forcing a polite smile. "I'm here about the disappearances and the Jersey Devil stories." He grunted and stepped aside. "Come in, then. It's not often I get visitors who don't run off after a day." The cabin's interior was sparse but cozy. A worn wooden table held an assortment of maps, hunting gear, and a half-empty thermos. Nell took a seat, pulling out her notebook. "So," she began, "you say you saw the Jersey Devil. What exactly did you see?" Jonas leaned back, eyes narrowing as if peering into a memory he'd rather forget. "It wasn't like any creature I've ever seen. Not just some myth or animal. This thing was bigger, darker. It moved wrong, like it wasn't bound by normal rules." He described a late summer evening when he was tracking deer near a river bend. The air had been heavy and still, the kind that presses against your skin and makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Then he saw it, a hulking shadow slipping between the trees. Its eyes burned like coals, piercing the dusk with an unholy glow. "It didn't run or walk," Jonas said, voice dropping to a whisper. "It glided, almost shifting, like the forest was a part of it, and it was part of the forest." Nell scribbled furiously, her pulse quickening. The image was far removed from the half-remembered tales of a winged beast or a devilish prankster. This was something primal, ancient. "Did it say anything? Make noise?" she asked. Jonas shook his head. No sound, just silence, like the world held its breath. Then it was gone, leaving nothing but a cold spot in the air. The room seemed to grow colder as the story unfolded, and Nell felt a shiver creep down her spine. She glanced toward the window, where the last light of day was fading fast. Outside, the forest pressed close, dark and unknowable. "You think it's the Jersey Devil, or something else?" Nell probed. Jonas's gaze darkened. "The Jersey Devil's just a face we put on the fear. But whatever's out there, it's older than the stories, older than the pines themselves." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden rustling outside. Nell's heart leaped as shadows flickered beyond the cabin's thin walls. Jonas grabbed a flashlight and stepped to the door, peering into the encroaching darkness. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his skepticism. Nell followed, the beam of light cutting through the gloom. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, something quick, darting just beyond the reach of the glow. Her breath caught. "This forest, it's alive," she whispered, more to herself than to Jonas, like it's watching. He nodded grimly, "And it doesn't like visitors." Back inside, Jonas pulled out an old leather-bound book filled with sketches and notes, his personal ledger of sightings and local lore. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the images were vivid, shadowy figures, strange symbols carved into bark, and cryptic warnings scrawled in margins. Nell pored over the pages, her skepticism giving way to a creeping dread. The stories weren't just folklore. They were warnings encoded in generations of fear. As night settled outside, Jonas lit a small fire in the hearth. The flames cast flickering shadows that danced across the cabin walls, lending an eerie life to the hunters' tales. "You've got to understand," Jonas said, his voice low. "The Jersey Devil's just the mask. The real terror. It's something buried deep, something that's waking up." Nell felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. The forest's whispers grew louder in her mind, weaving a tapestry of shadows and secrets that refused to be ignored. Hours later, as she lay on a cot in the cabin, sleep eluded her. The stories, the shadows, the cold eyes of that dark presence haunted her thoughts. Outside, the wind stirred the pines, carrying whispers that promised the forest's mysteries were far from solved. Tomorrow, she knew, would take her deeper into the heart of the pines and closer to the darkness that waited patiently beneath the trees. The sun dipped low behind the ragged horizon, painting the sky with bruised shades of purple and orange as Eleanor Nell Hayes tightened the laces on her boots and adjusted the strap of her backpack. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, the forest breathing around her with a slow, deliberate pulse. She had waited for this moment, the twilight hour when the pine barrens shifted from merely eerie to something palpably alive with menace. Her boots crunched softly on the carpet of fallen leaves as she stepped beneath the spreading canopy. The world dimming rapidly. Shadows coiled like serpents between the trunks, twisting and reaching with silent spectral fingers. Nell's breath came in shallow bursts, her senses sharpening with each step. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant in the unfolding mystery. A sudden rustle to her right made her freeze. Her eyes scanned the gloom, catching only the swaying branches and a scattering of crows taking wing. Just animals, she whispered to herself, though the tight knot of fear in her stomach refused to loosen. The dusk deepened, and the shadows grew longer, pooling at her feet like spilled ink. Nell's journal hung from her neck, the leather cover worn and familiar. She fingered its edges as she walked, her mind racing with fragments of Tommy's last entry's obsessions with the Jersey Devil. Strange lights flickering in the forest depths, whispers that no one else seemed to hear. Tonight, she hoped to find answers, or at least clues to the growing darkness. A twig snapped sharply behind her, a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. She spun, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The forest had fallen, eerily silent once more, as if holding its breath. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Nell strained to catch the words, but they dissolved into the rustling leaves. Pushing forward, she reached a small clearing bathed in the last fading light. Here, the trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches etched against the darkening sky. Nell's gaze caught movement of shadow slipping between two pines, darker than the growing night itself. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure seemed to flicker, its form shifting and intangible, eyes glowing faintly like burning coals. "No," she murmured, blinking rapidly. "It can't be." The shadow vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the whisper of leaves and a cold, lingering dread. Nell's hands trembled as she clutched her journal tighter. Was this the Jersey Devil? Or something older, more terrible, the primordial shade that Mabel had hinted at? As night fully embraced the forest, Nell made camp beneath a cluster of ancient pines. The fire she built sputtered weakly, the smoke curling into the dark sky like ghostly fingers. Sleep, when it came, was restless and fragmented. Vivid nightmares tore through her mind, visions of the forest alive, shadows writhing and whispering, shapes emerging from the darkness to claim her. She dreamed of Tommy, lost and calling out from beneath twisted roots, his eyes wide with terror. The primordial shade loomed, a shifting mass of darkness and flame, feeding on fear and despair. Nell awoke with a start, sweat slick on her skin, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Outside the fragile circle of light, the forest pulsed with an unearthly rhythm, as if breathing in tandem with her own ragged breaths. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, threading through the night air with promises and threats indistinguishable. Nell knew the forest was watching, waiting, and so was she. Her resolve hardened. The truth was no longer a distant theory, but a terrifying reality she had to face. The shadows and the pines were not figments of fear. They were something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for her all along. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the world in pale gold, Nell packed her journal and extinguished the fire. The forest seemed to exhale, releasing its hold on the night, but the dread lingered. A silent promise that the darkness was far from over. She glanced back once, catching a glimpse of movement among the treesies, like burning coals watching her departure. The whispers followed her steps, fading but never truly gone. The nightfall in the pines was a crossing point, one that would change everything. And Nell was no longer certain she would ever leave the forest unchanged. Deputy Marcus Flynn sat alone in his patrol car, the cold night air seeping through the cracked window as a faint mist curled round the edges of the forest. He rubbed his hands together, trying to stave off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The reports from the past weeks weighed heavily on his mind, the disappearances, the strange noises, the whispered rumors that he'd done his best to dismiss. But tonight, something gnawed at the edges of his certainty. Earlier that evening, he had reluctantly agreed to accompany Eleanor Nell Hayes on a patrol near the forest's edge. Nell, with her sharp eyes and relentless questions, had pressed him to revisit sites of recent disappearances. Marcus had been skeptical. He'd seen his share of panicked townsfolk spinning tales, but something about Nell's determination was infectious, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. The forest was a different creature at dusk. Shadows lengthened into grotesque shapes, and the usual sounds of night seemed muted or distorted. As they moved along a narrow dirt path, Marcus's instincts screamed at him to stay close to the firelight of the town. But Nell's probing gaze and keen mind pulled him deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, flicker of darkness darting between the trees. He stopped, heart pounding, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light or a restless animal. But the shape was too deliberate, too fluid. It moved against the natural rhythm of the forest, slipping between branches with an unnatural grace. "Did you see that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Nell's eyes narrowed. "I did. Something's out here with us." Marcus swallowed hard, the old certainty crumbling. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to nerves or exhaustion. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Back in the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Marcus sifted through reports, the pages blurring as his mind replayed the night's encounter. Nell was there too, leaning over the desk, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You can't keep ignoring what's happening," she said quietly. "There's something in the pines, Marcus, something real." He bristled at the accusation. "I'm charged with keeping this town safe, not chasing ghost stories." "But what if the ghosts are real?" The room fell silent, only the hum of the fluorescent light overhead filling the space. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe in logic, in reason, but the evidence was mounting against him. That night, alone in his patrol car, the forest pressed close. Whispers seemed to drift on the wind, unintelligible but unmistakable. Marcus's breath fogged the windshield as he scanned the darkness. Then, in the periphery of his vision, two glowing eyes reflected the moonlight from the woods. He blinked, and they vanished. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, heart hammering. The line between reality and something else blurred. The next morning, outside the local diner, Marcus found himself walking alongside Nell in the crisp dawn air. Neither spoke for a long moment, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. "I don't know what I believe anymore," Marcus admitted, voice low. Nell glanced at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Maybe belief isn't the point. Maybe it's about facing what's out there anyway." Marcus nodded slowly, the first cracks of trust forming. Together, they would have to confront the darkness creeping through the pine Barrens, whether it was myth, madness, or something far worse. As the sun rose behind the dense trees, the forest seemed to watch them silently, its shadows thick and unyielding. The battle for the truth had only just begun, and Marcus knew there was no turning back. The night still whispered secrets, and the forest waited. The forest around them seemed to close in as Nell followed Mabel deeper into the pine barrens, the dense canopy blotting out much of the afternoon light and casting long, shifting shadows over the gnarled roots that twisted like ancient serpents across the forest floor. Every footfall was muffled by a thick carpet of fallen pine needles and damp earth, the scent of moss and decay hanging heavy in the air, thick with the weight of centuries. Mabel moved with a quiet certainty, her thin frame weaving effortlessly through the underbrush, her silver hair catching the dim light like strands of moonlight caught on a spider's web. Nell struggled to keep pace, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. This was territory far beyond the ordinary, far beyond the realm of mere folklore and local legend. After what felt like an eternity winding through the tangled forest, they stepped into a clearing so sudden and stark it felt like crossing an invisible threshold. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and covered in thick moss. Its surface cracked and time-worn, but still bearing the unmistakable marks of ritual. Nell's eyes traced the intricate carvings etched deep into the stone-twisting vines, arcane symbols and strange figures that seemed part animal, part shadow. The designs pulsed faintly with an otherworldly glow, as if the very essence of the forest whispered secrets to those who would listen. Mabel's voice broke the silence, low and reverent. "This place," she said, "was once the heart of a sacred binding. The old ones knew the darkness lurking beneath these pines. They carved their prayers and warnings here to keep it chained." Nell reached out tentatively, fingertips brushing the cold stone, feeling the rough texture beneath her skin and the subtle hum that seemed to resonate from the ancient symbols. The air grew heavier, charged with a tension that raised the hairs on her arms. "What exactly were they binding?" Nell asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mabel's piercing eyes met hers, shadowed with the weight of knowledge and fear. Not the Jersey devil, child. Something older, something primal. The primordial shade. As if summoned by the name, a sudden breeze stirred the leaves overhead, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to echo from the very earth itself. Nell's breath caught as she scanned the perimeter, half expecting to see some dark shape lurking just beyond the tree line. They moved closer to a set of ancient trees surrounding the clearing, their bark carved with cryptic symbols and runes. Nell knelt to examine the markings, delicate yet haunting patterns that spoke of rites long forgotten. The carvings told of sacrifices, protections, and warnings against stirring the darkness beneath. Mabel placed a trembling hand on one tree, beginning a chant in a language Nell couldn't understand, the words twisting and curling through the air like smoke. The forest seemed to respond. The shadows deepened, and the faint glow around the carvings intensified. Nell felt a pulse beneath her fingertips, as if the very heart of the forest throbbed with ancient power. The boundary between past and present, myth and reality, blurred into a single moment of chilling clarity. Suddenly, a rustle in the underbrush snapped Nell's attention back to the present. Her eyes darted toward the movement, heart pounding fiercely, but only a small squirrel scurried away, disappearing among the fallen leaves. "You feel it too," Mabel said softly, a note of warning in her voice. "The old binding weakens. The primordial shade stirs once more." Nell swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation settling in her chest. This was no longer a story of lost hikers or local superstition. The forest itself was alive with a dark, terrible force, one that had been waiting, watching, bound beneath the bark and stone, but not defeated. They spent hours in the clearing, documenting the carvings and discussing the ancient rites. Nell's journal filled with sketches and notes, each discovery deepening the labyrinth of mystery she was trapped within. As dusk crept over the horizon, the forest sounds shifted, the usual chorus of birds and insects giving way to an eerie silence broken only by the distant howl of a lone coyote. The shadows lengthened, and the air grew colder, as if the forest was breathing, alive and watching. Mabel gathered her belongings, her eyes scanning the darkness with a practiced wariness. "We must be cautious," she warned. "The primordial shade does not awaken lightly." Nell nodded, her mind racing with questions and fears. What had her brother uncovered? What had drawn him into this ancient darkness? And how could she hope to confront a force so old, so vast, that even the forest trembled beneath its weight? As they made their way back through the tangled woods, Nell's journal clutched tightly in her hands. The whispers of the pines seemed to follow, soft, persistent, and full of secrets yet to be revealed. The night would bring no rest. The forest's ancient heart was stirring, and with it, the shadows beneath the bark whispered promises of dread and revelation. Nell knew this was only the beginning. Her story and the forest's were forever entwined now, bound by secrets carved in stone and shadow, waiting to be unearthed. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, a suffocating silence pressing in as Nell and Deputy Marcus Flynn stepped cautiously into the clearing. The sun, which had only moments before cast a soft golden light through the canopy, now waned behind gathering clouds, and a chill crept through the air that neither of them could attribute to the falling temperature alone. The animals, usually rustling and calling out somewhere in the underbrush, had fallen eerily silent. Not even a bird dared to sing. Nell's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around the journal she'd been clutching since dawn. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows. "This ain't normal, Nell. Something's wrong here." His flashlight cut through the dim, illuminating patches of moss and twisted roots, but the deeper shadows seemed to swallow the beam hole. A sudden rustle to their left made them both spin around. A fox darted across a fallen log, its eyes reflecting an unnatural red glow before disappearing into the thicket. Nell swallowed hard, the hairs on her neck standing erect. "Did you see that?" she asked. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice low. "That's not right. Animals don't act like that unless they're scared, or worse." As they moved deeper into the clearing, the temperature dropped further, their breaths visible in the cold air. Nell's fingers traced the carvings on a nearby tree symbols she had seen before in Mabel. Cranes' tails twisting and strange, seeming to writhe under her touch. Suddenly, the shadows at the forest's edge thickened and shifted, coalescing into a shape both amorphous and terrifying. Two eyes, glowing like burning coals, pierced the gloom. The form writhed, stretching upward like smoke in a breeze, then pulsed like a heartbeat. Nell staggered back, heart pounding as the forest seemed to exhale a dark breath. Marcus raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness but failing to fully illuminate the shape. "Whatever that is," he muttered, "it ain't any animal I've seen." The coal-like eyes blinked once, then vanished as swiftly as they had appeared, leaving only the oppressive blackness and the echo of a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Nell steadied herself, forcing her racing thoughts into focus. This is the primordial shade," she whispered, the name tasting like smoke on her tongue. "It's not just a legend anymore. It's real." Marcus exhaled slowly, the skepticism that had clung to him beginning to crack under the weight of what they'd just witnessed. "So what do we do now?" Before Nell could answer, a sudden movement caught her. Larger tendril of shadow slithered along the ground, wrapping itself around the base of a tree, squeezing tight as if drawing life from it. The bark blackened and cracked, exuding a coldness that seeped into the soil. "It's feeding," Nell realized, voice trembling. "Feeding on the forest, on fear." Marcus looked around, his jaw clenched. "We need to get this back to the others. They need to know what we're dealing with." As they turned to leave, the shadows seemed to pulse in protest, creeping closer, tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers. Nell felt a cold grip clutching at her chest, a whisper curling in her mind, words she couldn't quite make out, a promise of despair. Steeling herself, Nell pushed forward, her mind racing to piece together the warnings Mabel Crane had given, the ancient rituals whispered about in hushed tones. The primordial shade was awakening, and with it, a darkness older than the Pine Barrens itself. The forest seemed alive with menace now, every rustle a threat, every shadow a lurking horror. Nell and Marcus had crossed the threshold. They could no longer pretend this was folklore or superstition. The battle for the soul of the forest had begun. As they disappeared into the thickening gloom, the last thing Nell saw was the faint shimmer of those coal-black eyes watching, waiting, hungry for the fear that would feed the ancient evil once more. The primordial shade was stirring, and the echoes of its awakening would soon ripple through the very heart of the Pine Barrens. The night closed in around them, and the whispers in the pines grew louder still. The night settled over the Pine Barrens like a suffocating shroud, the dense canopy swallowing the last hues of twilight until the forest lay draped in near total darkness. Eleanor Nell Hayes sat by a small campfire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows that leaped and writhed across the uneven ground. The air smelled of damp pine needles and earth, thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. She held in her hands a worn, yellowed page torn from her brother Tommy's journal. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the faded ink, the words swimming before her eyes, obsessive notes about the Jersey Devil, strange sounds in the woods, and an unyielding dread that seemed to have taken root in his mind. Nell's breath caught in her throat as a sudden gust of wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it 1,000 faint voices that seemed to call out in agony and warning. The shadows cast by the firelight stretched and twisted, taking on forms that her rational mind struggled to dismiss. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus on the page, but the words felt heavier now, charged with an ominous weight she could no longer ignore. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What did you find here?" The forest around her seemed to lean in closer, the stillness pressing on her chest like a physical force. Nell closed the journal, pressing it against her heart as if seeking solace from the fragile paper. Memories of her brother's laughter, his last excited calls from the woods, and the hollow silence after his disappearance flooded her mind. The guilt was a relentless tide, pulling her under with every thought. She had promised herself she would find the truth, but the truth was beginning to feel like a nightmare she might never escape. The crack of twigs nearby shattered the silence, and Nell snapped her head toward the sound, hand going to the knife strapped to her belt. Out of the darkness emerged Deputy Marcus Flynn, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. His eyes, sharp and wary, flicked between Nell and the surrounding woods. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Marcus said gruffly, his voice carrying a mix of concern and reprimand. "I needed to be," Nell replied, her tone steady despite the turmoil inside. "I have to understand what Tommy was chasing." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "This forest, it's not just trees and shadows. There's something out there, something old and hungry. But chasing ghosts won't help anyone." "It's not ghosts," Nell said firmly. "It's something real, and I'm closer than ever." Their eyes locked, the tension between them palpable. Marcus was a man grounded in facts and law, and Nell was a woman drawn into the abyss of folklore and fear. Yet, beneath his skepticism lay a flicker of belief, born from years of witnessing the inexplicable. "I'll help you," Marcus finally said, his voice low. "But you have to promise me you'll be careful." Nell nodded, grateful for the reluctant alliance. It was a fragile bridge between two worlds, reason and myth, one she desperately needed to cross. The following day, Nell sought out Mabel Crane, the enigmatic herbalist whose piercing eyes seemed to hold the secrets of the forest itself. Mabel's small cabin was nestled among twisted pines, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and smoke. As Nell stepped inside, the dim light revealed shelves lined with jars of roots, powders, and strange talismans. Mabel looked up, her gaze sharp and knowing. "You carry the weight of loss," she said softly, "and the forest senses it. It feeds on fear and sorrow." Nell swallowed hard. "I need to know how to stop it." Mabel's eyes darkened. The primordial shade beneath these pines is ancient, bound by rites long forgotten. But those bindings weaken with every step humans take deeper into the woods. You must be careful. To fight it is to invite madness. "I'm already on that path," Nell admitted, the confession bitter on her tongue. Mabel approached, placing a gnarled hand on Nell's shoulder. "Remember, child, fear is a door. Walk through it with courage, or it will consume you." As Nell left the cabin, the shadows seemed to shift around her, the forest breathing with a life both beautiful and terrible. The burden of her mission pressed heavier, but so did a growing resolve. That evening, Nell found herself wandering the forest at twilight, the fading light casting long, distorted shadows between the ancient trees. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Her footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of needles, each sound magnified in the stillness. Her mind raced with memories of Tommy, Mabel's warnings, and Marcus's reluctant support. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she chasing a myth? Or was the darkness truly real, reaching out to claim her as it had claimed others? Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices, half-remembered lullabies, urgent warnings, and a low, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. Nell's heart pounded in her chest as the shadows around her deepened, coalescing into shapes that defied logic. Her breath caught, and a primal fear surged through her veins. Yet, amid the terror, a stubborn flame of determination burned brighter. She would face this darkness, no matter the cost. Back at camp, Nell jotted down her thoughts in her journal, the words a lifeline in the encroaching night. "Fear is the forest's weapon," she wrote, "but it's also my key. To walk through the shadows, I must first face the darkness inside." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the whispers of the pine barrens faded into silence, leaving Nell poised at the crossroads of fear and hope, ready to confront whatever horrors awaited her in the depths of the ancient woods. The night had changed her, and the forest was watching still, waiting for the next move in a game as old as the pines themselves. And Nell knew the next step would be the hardest yet. The night had settled over the pine barrens like a suffocating blanket, swallowing the small town in its dense, impenetrable darkness. Eleanor Nell Hayes moved cautiously through the thick underbrush, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, the faint rustle of leaves underfoot merging with the distant symphony of nighttime insects. Her breath came in shallow bursts, a mix of nerves and the cold air that bit at her skin. She was not alone. Ahead, a faint glow flickered, the telltale sign of a fire. The meeting place. She emerged into a small clearing ringed by towering pines, their skeletal branches reaching like dark fingers into the night sky. Around the fire, a gathering of faces, some familiar, others strangers, flickered in the firelight. Their expressions a mixture of fear, suspicion, and resolve. Nell recognized Deputy Marcus Flynn, his stocky frame leaning against a tree with arms crossed, eyes sharp and scanning. Beside him stood Mabel Crane, her long silver hair catching the firelight, her piercing eyes reflecting something ancient and knowing. Jonas Red, the woodsman, sat on a log, his rugged features shadowed but alert. Sheriff Linda Caraway lingered near the edge, her stance authoritative but tense. "Quiet down," Nell called softly as she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're here because something's wrong. People are disappearing. The forest isn't what it used to be. We can't just sit and wait for it to get worse." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. An older man, his weathered face etched with years of skepticism, spat, "Ghost stories and nonsense. It's the forest, it's wild. People get lost. That's all. It's more than that," Nell replied firmly. "I've seen the signs. The shadows moving on their own. The symbols carved into the trees. This isn't just superstition. There's something dark waking beneath the pines." Mabel stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of decades. The old pact was meant to keep it bound. But the bindings weaken. Fear feeds it. Division makes it stronger. Marcus shifted uneasily. "We've dealt with missing persons before, but this is different. I don't know what to believe anymore. But if it's true, we need to act carefully." The crowd divided visibly. Some looked to Nell and Mabel with cautious hope, others with growing suspicion. The sheriff's eyes bore into Nell, the unspoken challenge clear. "Can you really lead this fractured town against a legend?" Voices rose, heated debates breaking out, some arguing for confronting the darkness head-on, others pleading to ignore it, fearing panic and chaos. Nell's heart pounded as she navigated the shifting tides of opinion, realizing that the biggest fight might be to unite the people before they could face the forest's true horror. As the fire sputtered and the night deepened, Nell found herself forging fragile alliances with those willing to listen, while others turned away, their mistrust a cold wedge in the community's fragile unity. The forest breathed. It was not a breath like a living creature's, but a subtle, pervasive pulse that rippled through the air, the trees, and the very ground beneath Eleanor Nell Hayes's feet. As she stepped cautiously beneath the towering pines, the dense canopy blocked out much of the fading afternoon light, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, but beneath that, something fouler crawled at the edges of her senses, a metallic temps that made her stomach churn. Nell's boots pressed into the soft carpet of needles and fallen leaves, and every crunch seemed amplified in the unnatural stillness. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Instead, a faint susurrus threaded through the branches, the softest of whispers, barely audible, yet undeniably present. She stopped, heart pounding, straining to catch the words tangled within the breeze. They were fractured, like half-remembered secrets carried from the mouths of unseen lips. "Do you hear it?" Marcus Flynn's voice was low and gravelly behind her, his flashlight casting a narrow beam that danced nervously along the moss-covered trunks. His usually gruff tone was edged with unease. "I do," Nell whispered, swallowing hard. "It's like the forest is speaking." Marcus shook his head, a skeptical frown creasing his weathered face. "You and your stories. It's just the wind messing with your mind." But Nell wasn't so sure. The feeling was too real, too immediate. The forest seemed to respond to their presence, shifting subtly as if watching, waiting. A sudden rustle to their left made both spin toward the sound. Nell caught a glimpse of movement, shadow darting between the trees, too quick to identify. Her breath caught. The hairs at the back of her neck prickled. She reached instinctively for the small notebook she kept tucked in her jacket, fingers trembling as she jotted down the moment. Shadow moving just beyond sight, forest alive. Deeper into the woods, the atmosphere thickened. The air grew colder, and the light dimmer, as dusk bled into night. Nell's vision began to blur at the edges, the line between what was real and what was illusion fraying like worn fabric. Shapes flickered in the periphery, twisted limbs that might have been trees or something else entirely. The ground beneath her seemed to undulate softly, as if breathing with her. A low moan echoed, not quite wind, not quite animal. Her chest tightened with a rising panic. "Marcus, do you feel it? Like the forest is alive?" He nodded grimly. "Yeah, like it's watching us." Their footsteps quickened, crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. Nell's mind raced, memories of Mabel Crane's warnings echoing in her ears. The pines remember. They know. They wait. Later, in the dim warmth of Mabel's cabin, the flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls, thick with dried herbs and ancient tomes. Mabel's eyes, sharp and piercing despite her age, fixed on Nell with an intensity that made her shiver. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Mabel's voice was a hushed rasp, woven with urgency and sorrow. "The forest breathes with old fear. It feeds on what we carry inside, the doubt, the grief, the terror." Nell nodded, clutching her journal close. "How do we fight something like that?" Mabel's gaze darkened. "We don't. Not in the way you want. We survive by understanding, by respecting the balance. The primordial shade stirs, and it's hungry. But it's not just an enemy. It's a force older than us all." Outside, the night deepened. Strange, almost melodic sounds echoed, half songs, half wails carried on the wind through the skeletal branches. Nell pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block the creeping madness. The forest was alive, and it was watching. The following evening, Nell and Marcus traced a narrow, shadowed path, their flashlights weak swords against the blackness. Each step felt heavier, laden with an unseen weight. Suddenly, Marcus's beam caught a pair of glowing eyes, small, coal-like, unblinking, fixed on them from the underbrush. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a silence more frightening than any sound. "What was that?" Nell whispered, voice barely audible. Marcus exhaled slowly, a mixture of fear and resolve settling over him. Something, not quite human. Nell swallowed her rising terror, steeling herself. The forest's breath was no longer just a whisper in the wind. It was a living presence, a dark heartbeat that pulsed with ancient power. To unravel its secrets, she would have to face the shadows within and those lurking beyond. As they pressed onward, the whispers grew louder, and the darkness deepened. Somewhere in the depths of the pine barrens, the primordial shade stirred, and Nell could feel its gaze upon her. The forest was awakening, and so was the terror it concealed. She glanced back once more, the path behind swallowed by darkness, knowing that with every step forward, the boundary between myth and nightmare grew thinner. The whispers never truly ended, they only waited for the right ears to listen. And Nell was listening now. The night had swallowed the pine barrens whole, the thick canopy blotting out the stars and moon, leaving only the impenetrable darkness of the forest. Eleanor Nell Hayes moved cautiously, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the blackness, illuminating twisted branches and bristling underbrush. Beside her, Deputy Marcus Flynn's heavy steps crunched against the leaf-strewn earth, his leather jacket rustling softly. Neither spoke, the oppressive silence between them charged with unspoken dread. They had followed the cryptic directions Mabel Crane had given them, leading to a clearing deep within the forest where the ancient bindings of the primordial shade had once held sway. Now, that power waned, and the creature they sought to understand was stirring, its presence palpable even before they saw it. As they stepped into the clearing, a sudden chill gripped the air. Nell shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The usual symphony of night sounds, the rustling of leaves. The distant hoot of an owl had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against their eardrums. Shadows danced at the edges of their flashlights' beams, flickering and twisting in unnatural ways. Marcus tightened his grip on his flashlight, eyes darting nervously. "You feel that?" he whispered. "Yeah," Nell replied, her voice barely audible, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The darkness ahead thickened, coalescing into a mass that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Slowly, the amorphous shape began to take form, a swirling, shifting entity of shadow and smoke, its edges flickering like dying embers. Two burning coals glowed fiercely where eyes should be, fixed on Nell and Marcus with ancient malevolence. The primordial shade had unveiled itself. Nell's heart hammered in her chest as she instinctively stepped back, but the clearings seemed to shrink around them, the darkness pressing in with a tangible weight. The shade's form rippled, revealing glimpses of twisted, grotesque creatures lurking within its smoky, depth-twisted limbs and snarling faces that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "By God," Marcus breathed, his skepticism shattered. "It's real." Nell swallowed her fear. Reaching into her pack for the talismans Mabel had entrusted to her simple charms of wood and iron, etched with symbols from old rites. She clutched them tightly, reciting the incantations Mabel had taught her, her voice trembling but steady. The shade hissed, a sound like the rustling of dead leaves and the crackling of fire, and recoiled slightly. Tendrils of shadow lashed out toward them, their edges glowing with embers that burned without flame. The air grew thick, charged with a malevolent energy that clawed at their minds, threatening to overwhelm. Marcus raised his flashlight like a weapon, the beam cutting through the darkness, forcing the shade back a step. "Keep going, Nell." Summoning every ounce of courage, Nell pressed on with the ritual, her words weaving a fragile shield against the ancient evil. The creature writhed, flickering between forms, its fury palpable. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the primordial shade began to dissipate, melting into the shadows of the forest like smoke caught in the wind. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. Nell dropped to her knees, breath ragged, sweat slicking her brow. Marcus stood nearby, eyes wide, face pale but resolute. What was that?" Marcus finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Something older than any legend we've heard," Nell replied, her gaze fixed on the darkened treetops. "And it's far from done with us." The forest around them seemed to exhale, the night sounds slowly creeping back into the clearing, but the sense of dread lingered. A whisper in the wind that promised the battle for the Pine Barrens was only beginning. They rose together, knowing that the dark heart of the forest had been unveiled, and that whatever came next, they would face it with the fragile hope born from confronting the unimaginable. But as they turned to leave, Nell caught a flicker in the corner of her eye, an ember glowing faintly in the distance, like the lingering gaze of a nightmare that refused to fade. The primordial shade was watching, and it was waiting. The cabin was steeped in shadows, the only light coming from the crackling hearth that cast flickering shapes across the walls lined with bundles of dried herbs and ancient trinkets. Nell sat across from Mabel Crane, whose piercing eyes gleamed with a mixture of sorrow and fierce resolve. Between them lay a collection of brittle parchments, each etched with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight. Mabel's voice was low, almost a whisper, as she began to unravel the secrets of the old rites. These bindings were not just spells. They were promises made to the forest itself, a pact between the settlers and the darkness that dwelled beneath these pines. The primordial shade is older than any of us, and it feeds on fear on life. To hold it, we must channel not just power, but will. Nell leaned forward, her journal forgotten beside her as the gravity of Mabel's words sank in. The ancient texts spoke of circles drawn with sacred herbs, chants in forgotten tongues, and offerings made to the unseen forces that governed the land. It was a delicate balance, and any misstep could unleash horrors beyond imagining. Together, they prepared for the ritual, gathering rare herbs and relics Mabel had preserved through decades. As night fell over the pine barrens, the two women ventured deep into the forest, the moon a sliver in the ink-black sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every shadow seemed to twitch with unseen life. In a small clearing ringed by gnarled trees, Mabel began the incantations, her voice steady despite the palpable tension. Nell followed, repeating the words with trembling lips. The forest held its breath, the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures silenced as if watching. At the ritual's peak, a sudden gust snuffed out their fire, plunging them into darkness. The oppressive presence of the primordial shade pressed close, a cold that seeped into Nell's bones. Her heart hammered as the shadows seemed to writhe and coalesce around them, a shifting mass of coal-like eyes and amorphous shapes. Mabel's hand found Nell's, grounding her. Do not falter. The forest remembers. The pact endures. Relighting the fire, they completed the rite, a faint glow emanating from the circle's center. It was fragile, a tenuous thread holding back the encroaching darkness. Back at the cabin, Nell pored over the ancient texts by candlelight, each flicker casting dancing shadows that whispered of the forest's restless secrets. The knowledge was a double-edged sword. It gave her hope, but also revealed the scale of the danger. The primordial shade was no mere legend. It was a force older than the trees, and its awakening was inevitable unless the old rites could be adapted and renewed. As the night deepened, Nell felt the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, its whispers both a warning and a call to arms. The battle ahead would test her sanity, courage, and the fragile bonds of folklore and reality she now dared to believe in. And somewhere, deep beneath the pines, the ancient darkness stirred anew, waiting for the next move. The small town's community center was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with a charged mixture of fear and frustration. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a cold, sterile glow over the gathered crowd, their murmurs swelling into a cacophony of whispered fears and veiled accusations. Nell stood in the back, notebook clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes scanning the restless faces, some familiar, some barely acquaintances, all marked by the strain of recent events. At the front, Sheriff Linda Caraway attempted to restore order, her voice firm but strained. "We need calm," she pleaded, but the room was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Voices rose in conflict. One man, his face flushed with anger, shouted, "It's those damn kids wandering into the woods. If the town just locked down the forest, none of this would happen." "That's not it," another woman snapped back. "It's something older, something evil. You can't just blame kids for disappearing." The tension rippled through the crowd, splintering it into factions. Some clung to rational explanations, desperate to believe in natural causes. Others whispered of curses, myths, and the dreaded Jersey Devil. Nell felt the weight of their fear like a tangible force pressing against her chest. Deputy Marcus Flynn caught her eye from the side of the room, his weathered expression grim but steady. After the meeting dissolved into heated arguments, Nell found him outside the sheriff's office, the grey sky low and heavy above them. Rain began to fall, a steady, soft percussion on the roof, as if the forest itself was listening. "This town's breaking apart," Marcus muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "People are scared, and scared folks do stupid things." Nell nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. "We have to find a way to bring them together. If that thing out there is real, we're all going to need each other." Marcus sighed, glancing down the empty street. "I want to believe, Nell, but I've seen too much not to be skeptical. Still, what you're saying, it's starting to make sense." Their uneasy alliance was fragile, but it was a start. Later that evening, Nell made her way to Mabel Crane's cabin, the path swallowed by creeping darkness and thickening fog. The herbalist's home smelled of dried herbs and earth, the flickering flames of a crackling fireplace casting dancing shadows across walls lined with jars and faded photographs. Mabel's piercing eyes met Nell's as she settled into a worn rocking chair. "The forest remembers," she said softly, voice gravelly but resolute. "It holds secrets older than any tale you've heard. This darkness beneath the pines, it's not just a legend. It's a shadow of something primordial." She leaned forward, the scent of sage and pine heavy in the air. "There was a pact once, made by those who came before us, to bind that shadow deep beneath the ground. But the bond weakens as the forest is disturbed." Nell listened, the pieces of the puzzle grinding together in her mind, the weight of ancient dread settling deeper. The next day, walking alone through the dense underbrush as dusk bled through the trees, Nell felt the forest's breath close around her. The whisper of leaves in the wind sounded almost like voices' warnings carried on the breeze. Shadows lengthened and shifted, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Every step felt heavier, the isolation gnawing at her resolve. She stopped, heart pounding, eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. Was it the forest playing tricks, or was something watching? The boundary between myth and reality thinned with every passing moment. Back in town, the fractures among the townsfolk deepened. Rumors flourished. Blame was cast recklessly. Some barricaded themselves indoors. Others armed themselves with old charms and desperate prayers. The once tight-knit community splintered under the crushing weight of fear. Nell's attempts to unite them were met with suspicion or outright hostility. The isolation was no longer just physical, it was a growing chasm between neighbors, fueled by dread and mistrust. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Nell's determination hardened. If the primordial shade was truly awakening beneath the pines, if the ancient darkness was stirring once more, then unity was their only chance. If only she could convince a town unraveling at the seams. As night fell, the forest seemed to lean closer, its whispers louder and more insistent. Nell felt eyes in the shadows, cold and burning, watching, waiting. The fight was no longer just for truth, but for survival. And the forest would not relinquish its secrets easily. The fragile bonds of trust had shattered, and with them, the safety of the town. But the darkness was still coming, and Nell would face it alone if she must. The whispered voices of the pines never ceased, and neither did the creeping dread that clung to every leaf and shadow, promising that the nightmare was far from over. With a steadying breath, Nell stepped deeper into the night, bracing for the horrors still to come. The forest above seemed to hold its breath as Nell Hayes stood at the edge of a narrow fissure barely visible beneath the twisted roots of an ancient pine. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a rapid drum against the heavy silence that pressed down on the clearing. Marcus Flynn crouched beside her, his worn leather jacket catching stray shafts of pale afternoon light, his weathered face drawn tight with concern and determination. "You sure this is it?" Marcus's voice was low, rough with years of skepticism tempered by reluctant belief. "Looks more like a crack in the earth than some damn portal to hell." Nell swallowed hard, brushing damp moss aside to reveal a jagged opening descending into the earth. The air that rose from the fissure was cold and smelled of wet stone and something. Older, something rotted and alive. This is where Mabel's clues led us. The signs, the carvings, the old stories, they all pointed here. She pulled a flashlight from her pack and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the shadows to reveal a steep, rocky passage curling downward. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from below, a steady, rhythmic tapping that seemed to pulse in time with Nell's quickening heartbeat. "Well, hell," Marcus muttered, standing and dusting off his pants. "If we're going down, we do it fast." Nell nodded, determination hardening her features. "Let's find out what's really beneath the pines." The descent was treacherous. Roots tangled like serpents along the walls, and slick stones threatened to send them tumbling into the abyss. Mabel followed, her thin frame surprisingly nimble despite her age, carrying a bundle of dried herbs that filled the air with a sharp, almost medicinal scent. As they reached the cavern floor, the flashlight revealed walls etched with cryptic carvings, ancient symbols that twisted and coiled like living things, telling stories long forgotten by time. Nell knelt to trace a line of the carvings with a trembling finger, feeling an inexplicable chill spread through her. "These markings," Mabel whispered, her voice reverent, "are the bindings. They kept the shade dormant, sealed beneath the earth by our ancestors." Suddenly, the cavern seemed to breathe. The shadows deepened and shifted, coalescing into shapes that defied logic, forms that flickered in and out of existence like smoke caught in a gust of wind. A low hum began to fill the space, vibrating in Nell's bones and threatening to shatter her fragile composure. "It's here," she breathed, backing away slowly. The primordial shade. From the depths of the darkness, to burning coals flared into existence, eyes that glowed with a malevolent fire, watching, waiting. The amorphous shape surrounding them writhed, indistinct, yet terrifyingly alive. Mabel stepped forward, chanting softly in an ancient dialect, the herbs in her hands igniting in a flare of golden light that illuminated the cavern's oppressive gloom. The flickering flames cast monstrous shadows that danced along the walls, revealing the full horror of the shade's four-man, ever-shifting mass of darkness that seemed to consume the very light around it. Marcus raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, but the light seemed to falter against the entity's unnatural presence. "We need to hold it back," he said, voice shaking but resolute. Nell felt a wave of vertigo as the pulsing darkness pressed against her mind, whispering in a language older than human memory. Visions flashed before her, ice-twisted trees, bleeding shadows, endless nights filled with nameless terrors, and her brother Tommy lost in the void. "Focus," Mabel urged, her voice a lifeline. "The rites, Nell. You must remember." Summoning every ounce of strength, Nell reached into her memory, piecing together fragments of old stories, of whispered warnings, and of the ancient pact that had once bound the shade. The caverns seemed to contract, the darkness growing heavier, but the light from Mabel's herbs flickered stronger. "It feeds on fear," Nell realized aloud. "If we stand firm, we weaken it." The battle for the pines was no longer a distant legend whispered among scared townsfolk. It was here, beneath the roots and stones, a living nightmare clawing at the edges of their reality. As the cavern pulsed with malevolent life, Nell knew this was only the beginning. The ancient evil had been awakened, and the forest's shadows were watching, waiting for her next move. Her breath caught in her throat as the darkness shifted once more, and the eyes like coals burned brighter, promising that the whispers in the pines would never truly end. The chill of early evening seeped into the cabin's wooden frame as Nell sat across from Mabel Crane, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and old paper. The flickering candlelight danced over the faded maps and brittle parchments strewn across the table between them. Nell's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the jagged lines of an ancient map, her eyes darting between the symbols and the weathered journal pages she had painstakingly collected over the past weeks. Mabel's voice, low and steady, filled the cramped room. "The Jersey Devil," Mabel began, her piercing eyes reflecting the candle's flame, "isn't what most believe it to be, not truly." Nell leaned forward, curiosity sharpening her features. "Then what is it, exactly?" Mabel's gaze drifted toward the window, where the darkening pines swayed like silent sentinels. A story, a veil, a mask that hides something far older and far darker, the primordial shade. Nell's breath hitched. She had heard whispers of this entity before, an amorphous shadow lurking in the forest's depths, eyes burning like dying coals, but never had she connected it directly with the Jersey Devil myth. It was always a tale told to frighten children or explain disappearances in a way that kept them from looking too closely. "Why hide it behind the Jersey Devil?" Nell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the shade is ancient, older than any recorded history here. The Jersey Devil is a legend born from fear, yes, but it's also a story crafted to keep the townsfolk's eyes off the true evil," Mabel explained, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "People fear what they can name, what they can tell stories about. The shade feeds on fear, but it also thrives in the unknown. The legend is a shield, fragile but effective for now." The room seemed to close in around Nell, the weight of Mabel's words settling deep in her chest. She thought of her brother, Tommy, lost to the forest's shadows, and the countless others who had vanished without trace. How many had truly fallen to the Jersey Devil, and how many to something far worse? Later that evening, Nell met with Deputy Marcus Flynn and Jonas Reed at the forest's edge. The fading light cast long, sinister shadows beneath the towering pines. The three moved silently among the undergrowth, their flashlights casting narrow beams over moss-covered stones marked with strange carvings. Jonas knelt beside one, brushing away leaves to reveal symbols ancient and worn. "The stories Jonas told," Nell murmured, "they weren't just tall tales, they were warnings." Marcus grunted, his skepticism wavering as he studied the carvings. "I've patrolled these woods my whole life and never noticed this. It's like the forest itself is trying to tell us something." A distant owl's call echoed through the trees, a haunting reminder of the wilderness's watchful presence. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Nell felt the forest pulse with a life of its own, alive with menace and secrets. Back in town, Nell spent hours in the cramped local library, poring over yellowed newspaper clippings, folklore collections, and archived police reports. Her fingers traced a timeline of disappearances, each linked by subtle threads of myth and half-truths. The Jersey Devil was a constant presence in the stories, but the inconsistencies and contradictions hinted at a deeper, more terrifying reality. As the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, Nell's mind raced. The legend had been a convenient scapegoat, a story to explain the unexplainable, but the truth was far more sinister. Her final confrontation that night came at the boundary where town met forest. Marcus stood beside her, his usual gruff demeanor softened by dawning belief. The mist curled at their feet, swirling like living smoke. Nell presented her findings, her voice steady despite the cold gnawing at her bones. The Jersey Devil was never the real threat, she said. It was a story to keep us from looking too deep. But the primordial shade, it's real, and it's waking. Marcus's eyes narrowed, scanning the dark tree line. If that's true, what do we do now? Before Nell could answer, a low, shifting shadow flickered at the forest's edge, its coal-like eyes burning with ancient malevolence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Nell swallowed hard, the line between myth and reality blurring into a chilling certainty. The true horror lurking beneath the pine barrens was no longer just a story. It was a living nightmare awakening, and it was coming for them all. The night deepened, wrapping the town in a silence that thrummed with unseen danger. Nell's resolve hardened. The mask had been lifted, but the battle was only just beginning. "We need to prepare," she whispered, eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond, because the Jersey Devil was never the enemy. And with that, the shadows shifted once more, whispering secrets that no one should hear, secrets that promised a reckoning long overdue. As Nell turned away, the forest seemed to lean closer, its ancient breath cold against her skin. The primordial shade was no longer content to hide in the dark. It was ready to claim its dominion. The whispers never truly end. The forest around Eleanor Nell Hayes seemed to breathe, not with the gentle sighs of wind through the leaves, but with a heavy, suffocating pulse that pressed against her lungs and sank into her bones. Dusk had fallen hours ago, but the twilight lingered unnaturally, casting long, writhing shadows that slithered across the underbrush like living things. Nell's footsteps faltered as the shapes morphed, limbs of branches twisting into grotesque fingers, faces melting from bark, eyes glinting with malevolent amusement. Her breath came ragged, each inhale sharp and shallow, as if the forest itself sought to deny her air. "Nell," the whisper was soft, barely more than a tremor in the dark, yet it echoed in her mind like a scream. She spun, heart pounding, searching for the source, but the trees stood silent, stoic sentinels cloaked in shadow. The voice came again, clearer this time, but no one was there. It was her brother's name, spoken with a tenderness that twisted her heart. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the creeping panic. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, voice cracking. "This isn't real. It's just your mind playing tricks." The forest had been a puzzle, a mystery to solve. But now it was a prison, the walls closing in with every step she took deeper into the darkness. Her journal, once a source of clarity, had become a mocking mirror. She sat beside a gnarled root and opened it, the pages trembling in her hands. But the words, her carefully noted clues and observations, began to shimmer and warp. Letters bled into one another, sentences twisting into taunts. "You can't save him," the ink seemed to say. Nell slammed the book shut, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The weight of guilt for Tommy's disappearance pressed down like a physical force, and the forest fed on it, growing stronger with her despair. A sudden chill swept through the clearing, and the moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting silvery beams that danced like phantoms. In the shifting light, a figure coalesced, pale, translucent, and impossibly familiar. Tommy stood there, his eyes hollow yet pleading, fingers outstretched as if to reach for her. "Tommy," her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with hope and fear. The apparition flickered, wavering between the living and the dead. It beckoned her forward into the thickening woods. "Come," the vision urged, voice like the rustle of dead leaves. Nell rose unsteadily, drawn by an irresistible pull that defied reason. Every step deeper into the forest blurred the lines between nightmare and waking life. The trees whispered secrets in a language older than time, and shadows slithered at the edges of her vision. Suddenly, a hand gripped her arm, rough and urgent. She gasped, turning to see Deputy Marcus Flynn's weathered face, etched with concern. "Nell, you've got to stop this. You're not well." Her eyes flickered with confusion and desperation. "I have to find him, Marcus. He's here. I can feel it." Marcus shook his head. "This forest is getting to you. It's getting to all of us." He steadied her as she swayed, his grip firm but gentle. "You're slipping," he said quietly. "If you don't fight back, the forest will take you too." Nell's mind screamed in defiance, but exhaustion and fear gnawed at her resolve. The primordial shade's influence was a dark tide, washing away her certainty and leaving only shadows. Inside the small cabin she had claimed as a refuge, the walls seemed to close in. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shapes that mocked her solitude. She pored over her notes again, desperate to find a thread of truth in the chaos. But the words blurred and shifted, mocking her efforts, as if the forest itself conspired to keep its secrets locked away. She whispered to herself, piecing together fragments of ancient rites and warnings gleaned from Mabel Crane's cryptic tales. Yet each revelation was swallowed by mounting hallucinations, voices calling from the trees, visions of twisted faces leering from the darkness, the faint echo of Tommy's laughter turning into a scream. The line between reality and nightmare thinned until it vanished entirely. Nell found herself standing alone in the forest at midnight, the cold seeping through her clothes, breath visible in the frigid air. The primordial shade stirred, a shifting mass of coal-black shadow with eyes that burned like embers. It loomed just beyond sight, a presence felt more than seen, its hunger palpable. "You cannot run," it seemed to say through the rustling leaves. Panic surged, and Nell stumbled backward, heart hammering. The forest closed around her, whispering secrets too terrible to understand. Her mind fractured, a kaleidoscope of fear and despair. The scream that tore from her throat was swallowed by the darkness. As dawn approached, Marcus found her collapsed beside a twisted tree, skin pale and lips blue. Her hands trembled as she tried to speak, eyes wild and unfocused. "Nell, stay with me," Marcus urged, his voice thick with desperation. But the shadows lingered in her gaze, the whispers echoing in her mind. The forest had claimed a part of her, a part that might never return. Yet beneath the madness, a flicker of determination remained, fragile but unyielding. She had to fight, not only for her sanity, but for the truth buried beneath the pines. The ancient evil was awakening, and if she succumbed, it would win. The battle for her mind had only just begun. The forest waited, patient and eternal, its whispers never ending. The forest around them seemed to breathe with a sinister life of its own. Nell's boot sank slightly into the soft, mossy earth as she stepped cautiously into the clearing, the oppressive darkness folding around her like a thick shroud. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, was magnified in the stillness. The air was heavy, carrying the sharp scent of damp decay and something more intangible, like the weight of ancient sorrow and anger. Ahead, the shadows began to coalesce, swirling and writhing until an amorphous figure emerged. The primordial shade, as Mabel had called it, revealed itself in full, terrifying form. Its shifting shape absorbed the faint light, becoming a living void, but its eyes burned bright and unyielding, two coals glowing with malevolent intelligence. The creature's presence was a crushing force, pressing down on Nell's chest, and she fought the instinct to flee, steadying her breath. Behind her, Mabel's voice rose in a low chant, weaving words older than memory. Her thin fingers traced glyphs in the air and on the ground, the symbols glowing faintly with a spectral light. Nell knelt beside her, drawing the ancient ritual symbols they had painstakingly prepared. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This was no longer a story or legend. This was a battle for survival and sanity. Marcus stood nearby, his weathered face taut with tension, eyes darting between the creature and the protective circle they formed. He clutched a flare gun tightly, a last line of defense in a world where conventional weapons seemed meaningless. When the shade lurched forward, its shadowy tendrils reaching like claws, Marcus fired the flare into the sky. The sudden burst of brilliant light exploded overhead, scattering the darkness with a shower of red sparks and forcing the creature to recoil. But the victory was fleeting. The shade's form rippled, reforming with sinister grace, and the forest seemed to pulse around them, trees bending slightly, shadows deepening, whispering voices threading through the night air. Nell felt the creature's ancient malice clawing at her mind, dredging up memories of Tommy, of every lost moment and unanswered question. The whispers were a maddening chorus, threatening to unravel her grip on reality. Summoning every shred of strength, Nell rose, her voice ringing out against the oppressive silence. "You do not belong here," she shouted, the words carrying the power of defiance and hope. The ritual symbols flared brightly beneath her feet, a barrier against the encroaching darkness. The shade shrieked, a soundless howl that twisted the air, and for a moment the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Mabel's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the circle of light expanded, pushing the shadows back. Marcus moved to reinforce their position, his steady presence a grounding force amidst the chaos. Together, the three of them stood firm against a primal terror that had slumbered for centuries. As the night wore on, the battle waged not only in the physical realm but in the depths of their minds and souls. Nell's vision blurred, hallucinations flickering at the edges of her senses. Yet she held fast, the memory of Tamia beacon in the encroaching darkness fueling her resolve. Finally, the primordial shade faltered, its form dissipating into the whispering trees. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, though the forest remained alive with uneasy silence and watchful shadows. Nell sank to her knees, breath ragged but victorious for now. Marcus approached, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "We did it," he said, voice hoarse but steady. Mabel gave a solemn nod, her eyes reflecting both relief and lingering wariness. But Nell knew this was not the end. The ancient evil had been driven back, not destroyed. The forest's whispers would never truly cease, and the line between myth and reality had been forever blurred. As dawn's first light filtered through the canopy, Nell looked out over the pine's silent vast, and watching. A new chapter had begun, one where the stories they told might just hold the key to survival. With a final glance at the fading shadows, Nell whispered, "This is only the beginning." And the forest answered with a whisper that promised it would be waiting. The first light of dawn seeped hesitantly through the thick canopy of the pine barrens, casting long, fragile beams that barely penetrated the heavy gloom. Eleanor Nell Hayes stood at the forest's edge, her breath forming pale clouds in the crisp morning air. Around her, the world seemed muted, as if the very forest held its breath after the night's violent upheaval. The ground beneath her boots was damp, scattered with broken twigs and crushed leaves, the silent remnants of a battle fought in shadows and whispered fears. Nell's hands trembled slightly, not from cold but from the residue of fear and adrenaline that clung to her skin like a second layer. Behind her, The town was waking slowly, already abuzz with hushed conversations and the cautious return to an uneasy normalcy. Yet, as she looked back into the forest, the dark heart of the pines seemed to pulse quietly, alive with secrets and threats that refused to be silenced. She turned away reluctantly, knowing that the day ahead held its own challenges. The battle with the primordial shade had ended, or so they hoped, but the scars it left, both seen and unseen, would linger. Nell's footsteps were heavy as she made her way toward the town hall, where Deputy Marcus Flynn and Mabel Crane waited. The trio had become an unlikely coalition, united by shared terror and a fragile trust forged in fire. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion. The walls, once a place of bureaucratic order, now bore the weight of whispered fears and unspoken questions. Marcus leaned against a worn wooden table, his face weathered and drawn, his usual gruff demeanor tempered by a solemn gravity. Mabel sat nearby, her silver hair a stark contrast to the dim room, her eyes sharp despite the wear of age. "We held them off," Marcus said, breaking the silence, voice low but steady. "But it's not over, not really." Mabel nodded, her fingers curling tightly around a small talisman she always carried. The forest breathes still, and so does the darkness beneath it. Nell swallowed hard, the words echoing what she had feared since their confrontation in the cavern. The primordial shade was a force, older and more resilient than any of them had imagined. It wasn't just a creature to be fought and defeated. It was an ancient presence, woven into the very soil and roots of the pines. "We need to warn the others," Nell said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If the shade is still here, if it's watching, then everyone has to be ready." Marcus's eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and frustration. The town's shaken. Some want to leave, others want to forget this ever happened. But fear can be as dangerous as the shade itself. Mabel's gaze pierced them both. Fear feeds the darkness. We must find balance, or the cycle will begin anew. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden chill that swept through the room, as if the forest itself had exhaled a cold warning. Nell felt a shiver race down her spine, her senses sharpened by months of vigilance. Later, in the solitude of her rented cabin, Nell sat by the window, the forest shadows stretching long and restless beyond the glass. Her journal lay open on the table, pages filled with frantic notes, sketches of symbols, and fragmented thoughts. Yet tonight, she found herself unable to write. Instead, her mind replayed the horrors she had witnessed, the shifting coal-eyed shadow, the whispering trees, the relentless dread that seeped into her bones. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it faint murmurs that seemed almost like voices. Nell pressed her palm against the cool glass, a silent plea for peace that felt impossibly distant. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes wide, tired, haunted. The battle had changed her, carved deep lines of fear and determination into her soul. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a rustling among the trees nearby. Nell's heart surged as she stood, moving cautiously toward the door. Outside, Marcus's silhouette emerged from the darkness, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "Did you hear that?" Nell whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. "The pines aren't done with us yet." Together, they moved into the night, senses alert. In the shadows, a pair of coal-red eyes blinked once before vanishing into the blackness. The primordial shade had not been banished. It was waiting, watching, its hunger undiminished. Nell swallowed her fear and squared her shoulders. The forest's whispers would never end. Neither would her fight. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the horizon again, Nell knew this was only the beginning of a longer, darker journey, one where the line between myth and reality had forever been blurred, and where the shadows of the Pine Barrens would haunt her dreams and waking hours alike. The echoes of the forest's ancient darkness lingered still, a reminder that some evils never truly sleep, and that some stories never find their final chapter. The town of Pine Hollow gathered beneath the flickering lights of the community center, a drab building that seemed to absorb the weight of unease pressing down upon its walls. The air inside was thick with tension, voices rising and falling like restless winds through the pines outside. Eleanor Nell Hayes stood near the back, her arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes scanning the crowd. Faces she recognized, some etched with worry, others hardened by fear or disbelief, turned toward the podium where Sheriff Linda Carraway attempted to maintain order. "We need answers," a voice cut through the murmur. "People are still disappearing. We can't just wait around for stories and legends to save us." Sheriff Carraway's gaze swept the room. "I understand your fear. We're doing everything we can with the resources available. But these disappearances," she faltered, caught between enforcing reason and acknowledging the unspoken dread that gripped her town. Deputy Marcus Flynn stepped forward, his weathered face shadowed with fatigue. "It's not just accidents. Something is out there, something none of us fully understand. But panic won't help. We need to stay united." Murmurs of agreement and dissent clashed in a cacophony of voices. Nell felt the fragile threads of community fraying under the strain of fear and uncertainty. She knew better than anyone the dangers lurking beyond the tree-lined threats, not just of flesh and bone, but of ancient, shadowed power. Later that evening, Nell made her way to Mabel Crane's cabin, the narrow path winding through the thickening forest illuminated only by a waning crescent moon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. But beneath it lurked something colder, something that made her skin prickle with unease. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the sky as if whispering secrets in a language older than time. Inside, the cabin was warm, lit by the flickering flames of a small hearth. Mabel sat with her hands folded, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The darkness doesn't sleep," she said softly, voice carrying the weight of generations. "It watches, waits. It feeds on the fear we carry, the stories we tell." Nell nodded, the fragments of her brother Tommy's journal turning over in her mind, his obsession with the Jersey Devil. The strange patterns he had uncovered, the warnings he had ignored. "It's still here," she whispered, "the primordial shade." Mabel's gaze hardened, "And it grows stronger. Every shadow is a breath, every silence a heartbeat. We cannot fight what we do not see, but we must not let it consume us." The following nights brought no respite. Deputy Marcus patrolled the quiet streets, the usual sounds of nocturnal life replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. His breath came out in shallow puffs, eyes darting to the darkness beyond the street lamps. Every shadow seemed to flicker, to shift with a life of its own. He felt it, a presence just beyond perception, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as an oppressive chill wrapped around his spine. Back at Nell's temporary home, she sat by the window, journal open on her lap. The whispering wind carried faint voices, indistinct and teasing, as if the forest itself was trying to speak. She traced the patterns in Tommy's notes, searching for a thread to pull, a way to unravel the ancient darkness that clung to the pines. Days blurred into restless nights. The town's wounds remained raw, the disappearances unresolved. Some villagers turned inward, shutting their doors and windows against the encroaching fear. Others sought solace in old legends, lighting candles or leaving offerings at the forest's edge. But the primordial shade was patient. It thrived in the cracks between belief and denial, in the spaces where shadows gathered and hope flickered low. At the heart of it all, Nell felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier with each passing moment. The forest's secrets were far from fully unearthed, and the unseen shadows whispered promises of darker days ahead. As the wind moaned through the pines, carrying with it the faintest hint of a scream, she knew the battle was far from over. The whispers never truly end in the pine barrens. They linger, echoing in the minds of those who listen, weaving tales that blur the line between myth and reality, and feeding the ancient darkness waiting just beyond the reach of light. The road stretched out before Eleanor Nell Hayes like a ribbon unraveling into the night, the taillights of her old sedan cutting through the thickening dusk like twin beacons of fragile resolve. Behind her, the pine barrens receded into a shadowed silhouette, ancient trees standing like sentinels guarding secrets older than memory itself. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth, but beneath that familiar forest aroma lurked something more elusive, a whisper, a pulse, a lingering breath of the darkness she had come to know too intimately. She glanced in the rearview mirror, catching the last glimpse of the dense forest canopy melting into the night sky. It was as if the trees themselves exhaled a silent sigh, their shadows stretching long and thin, reaching out like fingers reluctant to relinquish their hold. Nell's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale in the low light. The weight of what she had witnessed, the unnameable horror beneath the pines, the ancient evil that defied all reason pressed down on her chest like lead. Memories flooded her mind, the shifting coal eyes of the primordial shade, the twisting shadows that seemed to throb with malevolent life. Mabel Crane's cryptic warnings, spoken in a voice as dry as the brittle leaves underfoot. The darkness never leaves, Mabel had said, her gaze piercing. It waits, it watches, and it whispers. Nell swallowed hard, the taste of old fear bitter on her tongue. The forest had marked her, altered the very fabric of her being. As much as she tried to leave the pines behind, a part of her remained tethered to its ancient dread. The car radio crackled suddenly, static filling the silence before a faint melody emerged, an old folk tune that seemed to echo from another time, another place. It was disjointed, like a signal struggling to break through a veil of interference. Nell's heart skipped. She reached to turn it off, but paused as the song wove its melancholy thread through the night air. It was a lullaby for the lost, for the forgotten souls swallowed by the forest's hungry shadows. Her thoughts drifted to Tommy, her brother, whose disappearance had sparked this harrowing journey. The journal fragments she'd found, scribbled in his hurried hand, spoke of fear and fascination, of glimpses beyond the veil. Had he truly understood the danger lurking beneath the trees, or had he been consumed by the same darkness that now haunted Nell's every step? The miles slipped away beneath the tires, but the forest's whispers followed, a persistent susurration at the edge of her consciousness. She caught herself turning her head, as though expecting to see a shadow flit across the rear window, or a pair of burning coal eyes watching from the roadside. There was nothing but the empty road and the hum of her engine. Still, the unease gnawed at her, a reminder that the primordial shade was not merely a creature of legend or nightmare, it was a force woven into the very soil. The trees and the stories told in hushed tones around flickering campfires. The Jersey Devil was but a mask, a feeble myth to veil the true terror that thrived beneath the pines. Later, in the solitude of her Philadelphia apartment, the silence was thick and suffocating. The windows rattled softly in the night breeze, carrying with it a faint rustling that seemed almost unnatural. Nell sat at her desk, the journal open before her, pages filled with the tangled threads of her investigation. She traced a finger over the faded ink, feeling the weight of the past pressing down. Outside, the city pulsed with indifferent life, a stark contrast to the ancient wilderness she had left behind. Yet, the whispers had not ceased. They murmured in the shadows, in the silence between heartbeats, a reminder that some darknesses are eternal. Nell leaned back, eyes heavy but alert. The forest's voice was a haunting melody she could neither forget nor fully understand. The lines between myth and reality had blurred irrevocably, and though she had escaped the pines physically, the shadows had taken root within her. As dawn threatened the horizon, Nell's thoughts swirled with questions unanswered and fears unspoken. Had she truly survived, or merely been drawn deeper into the forest's endless night? The whispers never end, and neither, it seemed, did the darkness. Outside, the wind stirred the trees once more, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sigh of promise that the pine barrens would keep their secrets, and that the primordial shade would wait patiently for the next soul brave or foolish enough to listen. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the ancient evil pulsed, awakening anew with the first light. "You never really leave," Mabel had said, her voice a rasp like dry leaves scraping stone. Nell's mind echoed with those words now as the city's noise faded into a distant hum. The forest's whispers were inside her, a dark lullaby that would haunt her dreams and waking hours alike. She closed the journal, the pages rustling softly, and stared out the window. The night was quiet, but she knew better. The shadows were watching, waiting, and the story was far from over.